All right, good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the Hinckley Institute of Politics and today's Hinckley Institute Forum. My name is Nick Cockrell. I'm the Managing Director of Community Engagement here at the Hinckley Institute. And here, we're a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster a public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, and we bring in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is titled Ethics in a Post-Liberal World, AI, Creature or Creator. This event is sponsored by the Department of Political Science and is presented as part of the Wormuth Endowed Lecture Series. This endowment makes possible symposia, lectures, and initiatives that are at the intersection of international and American politics. I also want to offer some quick words of thanks to Professor Brent Steele, the chair of the Francis D. Wormuth Lecture Series, for his leadership. Also, to the Carnegie Council team, including Brian Mateo. Now I'm excited to introduce today's speaker. Joel Rosenthal is the president of the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. As a nonprofit leader, scholar, and teacher, he works to empower ethical action with a particular focus on U.S. foreign policy, issues of war and peace, human rights, and pluralism. At the Carnegie Council, Rosenthal leads a team that identifies critical ethical issues, convenes experts, and produces agenda-setting resources to educate and activate communities globally. Rosenthal is editor-in-chief of the Ethics in International Affairs Journal, published by Cambridge University Press. His first book, Righteous Realists, is an examination of the political realists who shaped World War II America in the nuclear age, including Hans Morgenthau, Reinhold Niebuhr, and George Kennan. His current writing and commentary can be found at the President's desk. Rosenthal is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Distinguished Scholar Award from the International Studies Association for his lifetime achievement in international studies, and an honorary degree of Doctor of Social Science from University of Edinburgh. He received his PhD from Yale and BA from Harvard University. So with that, please join me in welcoming our guest today.
That's great, thank you. That's a really nice introduction. Well, I feel like I've come home to Utah. I see in the audience Dean Chatterjee, David Jackson. So I've been out here before thanks to their leadership in the field of ethics in international affairs. You should all know that even though we're based in New York and we work internationally, a lot of our thinking comes back to some of your faculty here, including Dean and David and, of course, Brent Steele. So thank you for the opportunity to come back to Utah and to share some thoughts about two things that have been on my mind, and they're in the title, sort of a bargain, Brent, on this, which is I wanted to talk about ethics in a post-liberal world, and then there was a lot of interest in AI, so I thought we'd try to do both in this lecture today. And one of the reasons that I'm here is very much interested in getting your views, genuinely interested. I'm not really here to give a lecture. I'm willing to do my part to share my thoughts, my thinking, what's happening at Carnegie on these issues. But very much aware that with things changing and changing so fast, you can't do ethics alone. You know, I mean, you can sit there and read a book and think and whatever, but to do this work really, really well requires exchange and requires dialogue. And I'm thinking of it, the more I do this, I think it's not, ethics, the kind of work we do shouldn't be vertical, like somebody up here teaching you or whatever, but there's a time for that, but it also needs to be more like horizontal, where there's more conversation and discussion and input. So that's why I'm here. That's why I'm standing here. And I always start all of my conversations about ethics with the notion of humility. And I think it's important to start a conversation like that with some humility and putting up front the fact that I'm coming here. You're going to see, you can see it's in the title, right? Creature, is it still up there? It turned off. Well, there we go. AI, creature or creator, there's a question mark there. There's going to be a few more question marks in this conversation, and I'm hoping you can help me work through some of them. So first point is the world that I grew up in, and I'll speak for Dean and David, maybe for Brent. Our generation, the world we grew up in, the liberal world, is gone. And if there was any doubt about it, read the news today. That's gone. And the world that the students here are graduating into is, I'm going to call it a post-liberal world. I don't know whether that's a good label or not, but I don't have anything better. So we'll call it the post-liberal world. And that world is emerging. And at first I used the word fading and emerging, but again, it seems to be happening quite quickly. And this shift is what political scientists call normative shift. Norms can be an off-putting word in casual conversations, but it's really a very simple idea. Norms are expected and required behavior. What are the rules for our world? And those norms are always changing. And behind those changing norms are always changing power dynamics. So that's what we're living through now, this normative shift between a liberal world and a post-liberal world. So what does that signify? What does it mean for you individually? What does it mean for our country? And what does this shift mean for the world? So here's what I want to do in this hour, to try to shed some light on these questions, and you can see lots of question marks. But I plan the talk in 3 sections, and I'll try to move through it expeditiously. First, what was the ethical basis of the liberal world order? Where did it come from? And why is it expiring? Second, what is the ethical basis of the post-liberal order, this new thing we're going into? Where does that ethical basis come from, and how is it likely to develop? And third, how should we think about global scale issues in this new context? And I'm going to use the example of AI as our case study for the discussion. So first, the liberal world order. I gave a version of this talk earlier, and I know I spent way too much time on it, but it's like where I come from, is what I do. And you can see Andrew Carnegie's likeness there on the slide. So I'm going to claim that the liberal world order is not really a post-World War II idea. It's not a 1945, 1948 idea with the UN and its agencies and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I want to go back to 1914. I want to go back to the beginning of the 20th century. I want to go back to Andrew Carnegie, the beginnings of international law and organization, as that's where it was. And I use this term, Andrew Carnegie's universal moral sense. By the way, just a little bit of a disclaimer here. Carnegie's going to sound really, really good in all the things I'm going to talk to you about, and there is this element of it. It's not all perfect with other dimensions of how he gained his fortune and so on. It's a long story in another lecture, but I'm channeling here this one element of his commitment, which we saw in his philanthropy, to this universal moral sense. And I read this morning this long letter that he wrote at the beginning of 1914. Okay, 1914, for those of you who study international relations, you should remember 1914, just before World War I broke out. His New Year's proclamation, which he actually published in a magazine, it was like an open letter to all of his fans. You know, everybody knew who Andrew Carnegie was. He was known as the richest man in the world. He was beginning his philanthropy at that time. And you can think his profile in public life was sort of like Bill Gates, before the scandals, right? Everybody knew who he was. So he writes this letter, and the letter says basically that peace is at hand, that we all recognize now that we're in the 20th century that the worst thing that humans can do to each other is killing each other. And that now that we're in the 20th century, we've progressed to the point where we don't kill each other, particularly with machines, now that we have the means of industrial war. We're going to put that aside in the 20th century. And we're going to, just like we don't have duels anymore, right? Gentlemen don't, you all saw Hamilton, right? The dueling, right? That's a matter of honor. No, we put that into the past. And we're going to do the same thing with war because it makes absolutely no sense because society is improving. And this is a moral argument. We shouldn't kill each other in war, and we are not going to do it. And so again, this is in January of 1914. But for Carnegie, he said, we need to develop the institutions and the social arrangements to make this the norm. That war shouldn't be the norm. Peace should be the norm. Peace should be a set of arrangements. And this was not naive or idealistic. It was very practical. Carnegie was a businessman, right? He was a very practical guy. So for him, peace was not some abstract thing. It was like almost like a business deal. Like, let's do this because it will be good for people. And so this was the beginning of international law and organization. And so Carnegie started his philanthropy, and he began with, by the way, funding the Peace Palace at The Hague. If you go to The Hague and visit the Peace Palace, that building there was funded by Andrew Carnegie. He said, we need to build a place to do this kind of work. And he had a deal with the government of the Netherlands, and they built the Permanent Court of Arbitration there. He also provided the funding for the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907, which was the beginning of what became what we now call international law. And the idea was very simple. We have law in domestic society, a procedure of mediation and arbitration for resolving conflicts. And Carnegie's view was this system was in place domestically. We just need to do it internationally. Let's have international law so that when we have a dispute, we won't go to war. We'll bring it to the court, and then the great powers will have treaties of arbitration. They'll agree to whatever the settlement is, and that's what'll happen. And for any of you who are like little footnotes to history, you should Google the Venezuela crisis of 1895. It's like a perfect example for today. If you say, what's the counter-narrative? Like, if you don't like what's happening today, well, 1895, there was a border dispute between Venezuela and the British colony there in Guyana, and Carnegie, by the way, was part of this. He said, let's bring it to the court. Let's arbitrate this. Let's mediate this so that there's not a war over it. And this was the way of thinking. And so as we move into 1914, there were other disputes in the Balkans and other places. But the idea was to bring these disputes to the court so they could be settled. So here's the thing. So Carnegie builds the court, starting international law and organization and having some success. But the point was, he said, it's not enough just to build these new arrangements, these new institutions. We have to change the way people think. We need to change the norm. Like, what do we do when there's a conflict? Bring it to the court. We need a massive normative shift. And that's why he founded organizations like Carnegie Council, Carnegie Endowment, and these other Carnegie places that were actually meant to help change the way people are thinking about international peace and cooperation. I mentioned to some of you before some of these other Carnegie institutions. Some of them are kind of colorful. I'll just mention one here, which is kind of interesting to give you a sense of how to change a norm. Carnegie was very upset by the idea that the idea of a hero is always a military hero, like in popular culture. Heroism is represented by courage in battle. Right? So he said, I'm going to start a new institution with my philanthropy. I call them the Carnegie Hero Funds. And the Hero Funds are meant to recognize heroes of everyday life. So it was frequently, first responders who run into burning buildings to save people, or jump into icy waters, or good Samaritans, or people to find these heroes. And actually what they do is this is in early 20th century, call a press conference, give them publicity, make sure it's in the newspaper, and pin a medal on their chest, just like a military medal, that they get the full honor of their community. But he saw this as a peace effort, right? It was this sort of subtle idea that we had to change this sort of, in some ways, his nemesis was Theodore Roosevelt, this sort of, hyper-masculine, violent, bloodlust kind of idea of what a hero and what courage is, that there are different ways of thinking about this. So this was this is Andrew Carnegie's universal moral sense. And I put up here, I'm not going to belabor this, and it was almost embarrassing to do this. One of the problems I've been having about talking about the liberal world order is the world that I grew up in, it was so obvious that if you got up and started, talking about what the principles were, people were saying, why is this? What is this? This is, of course, like this is just a given. This is a premise. We all know this. Tell me something interesting, But I realize now that all of these things, and if you look at them, they're under some stress. A commitment to international cooperation, right? Not a given anymore. But also as a moral proposition that cooperation is moral because it recognizes the idea of mutual interest, right? I think if you go just one step below it, what is, okay, it sounds like a sort of surface level cooperation, okay? But what does cooperation mean? It means there's a recognition of mutual interest, some kind of working out of my interests and your interests, okay, in a peaceful way. Defense of democracy, this idea that there is an open system consisting of checks and balances that will protect the rights of individuals and also stand up for universal human values. Fidelity, okay, we'll talk about information, disinformation, but again, at least a principled commitment to the truth, to honesty, to integrity, and the humanitarian imperative, which is the equal moral worth of all individuals. So what unites these four foundational principles is important, and this is the kind of the liberal part of it for me, which is the liberalism here is substantial, meaning the substance of these principles are liberal, but also procedural. It's both. The liberal view respects and protects rights, and it's committed to the idea that rights are defined and executed according to an agreed upon process of compromise and trade-off. And it's based on the idea that power is restrained by principles and process. Power is restrained by principles and process. But what's happening today is we're moving into this post-liberal phase. We're giving up on this idea. So, post-liberal. Again, some of this may seem obvious if you're reading the news, but I think I was trying to use this as an opportunity to say, well, what specifically do I mean? So the first point I want to make is this idea of rupture. Some of you may have read in the news about Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney's speech at Davos at the end of February. And I would recommend it to you to either watch or listen to. It's a brilliant speech. I think it's a historic speech. And in that speech, he said, "We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition." Again, I think the news today verifies that. And for me, I think this is a historic moment. It's a moment at the level of when Winston Churchill went to Fulton, Missouri in the 1940s, just after World War II, and he made his famous speech about an iron curtain descending upon Europe, right? He was announcing a new global moment, the Cold War, which lasted until another great speech moment, Ronald Reagan in Berlin. I'm sure you've seen the clips. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. This sort of symbolic moment of the end of the Cold War. And it's my conclusion that Carney's rupture, not a transition speech and sentence is going to be the signature phrase of this new order. What I want to focus on here is Carney's invoking not only a political rupture, but a moral rupture, an ethical, something's changing at the level of values. And what's happening here is really the opposite of Carnegie's view that I was explaining before. And it's not only an international issue, it's a domestic issue. The structural breach in world order is so fundamental. We need to understand it. We need to understand this collapse at the level of basic values to fully comprehend what is happening. So in my view, I think it's a dark and chaotic picture, and the word rupture is apt, as it captures the energy and the totality of the break. And it also suggests an instability and uncertainty to follow. So it's important for me to preface this next part by saying I am not a political person. It's not really what I do or the purpose of my talk, but we're going to get into some politics here, and I'm trying to keep it as descriptive and as empirical as possible so we can understand the world we're in. And I do not think it's controversial, although I'll be interested in any comments you may have about this, but that the animating figure in this story is President Donald Trump. So he's the loudest voice, the most powerful actor, and his values are providing both a catalyst and an accelerant for this move into the post-liberal disorder. We can talk about Davos again. Greenland. President Trump said, I'd like to make a deal, the easy way, but if we don't do it the easy way, we're going to do it the hard way. Right? That was in February, and he reiterated those remarks yesterday in a press conference. And this was before the military operation in Venezuela to remove Maduro and the attack on Iran, which followed. And you see in the slide, I used the phrase gunboat diplomacy and spheres of influence. For me, it's quite remarkable. I remember these were like questions you would get on a quiz about 19th century American diplomatic and history and foreign policy, right? The era of gunboat diplomacy and all this kind of stuff. So very much, it's like a textbook modern version of that. So I think the main thing is, I just want to emphasize here how provocative and deliberately transgressive this is from where we were. I have a whole section here about Trump illiberalism. I'll kind of skip over most of it, but I think the main points are his consolidation of power, his use of power to address his issues with people and institutions he considers his enemies, and his insistence on the sort of full executive authority and an expansive view of executive power, including the deployment of U.S. military domestically, the story about ICE, questions about the coming midterms. But moving back to the foreign policy part, renaming the Department of Defense the Department of War, and I'll just leave you with this quote from Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense Hegseth, that this department now favors lethality over legality. I think the qualifiers were, something about, anyway, it was about tepid legality. Anyway, his point was that, it's all about the use of kinetic military force. So in principle, this post-liberalism can come from the left or the right. We're living through clearly a right-wing moment. And then just to bring this to the news of the day, a good example of a non-Trump post-liberal is President Viktor Orban in Hungary. So no surprise that President Trump has been endorsing Viktor Orban for his re-election in the election in Hungary next week. And that as I speak, Vice President J.D. Vance is actually in Hungary endorsing President Orban. If you want to get a fuller sense of what I mean by post-liberal and illiberal, I would commend to you some of the speeches by Viktor Orban, because he's just so clear about how he expresses his principled position of illiberalism and post-liberalism as something that's his stake in the ground. Okay, and in particular, I think it's a speech of 2014 when he was earlier on the scene, where he points out in great detail what he means by illiberal and post-liberal. Another part of this story I want to emphasize is, again, this consolidation of power, strongman politics, power unrestrained. This is, I think, an objectively observable element of what we're seeing. And here I have to invoke our friend Hans Morgenthau, our mentor, Politics Among Nations from the Cold War era, where he, as a person who had lived through the 1930s and had seen the results of unrestrained power in the state, warned of this. And his phrase was, dominance, the idea of using power in this dominant way, in this post-liberal way, is a dark vision that ends badly. And all the good realists, the true realists, this was the subject of my book, understood this. Realism, crudely understood, is, oh no, it's all about power. You maximize power and you use power and you subjugate people, right? No, the idea of realism is understanding how power works, is understanding the limits of power, understanding the interests of others, trying to figure out arrangements that will lead to a better world. And the realists would like to point to this idea of the power gone mad. The Athenian generals in the Melian dialogue in the Peloponnesian War, the strong do what they will, the weak do what they must, right? Well, that sounds good. And we got people actually quoting that like that's a good idea. They didn't finish the book, right? The Athenians went power mad and they eventually, through their own hubris, they fall to Sparta, because they thought they were invincible. They thought that they could tell people what to do and rule in that way. And so too did the National Socialists in Europe and in Germany and communists in the 20th century, the idea that they had power, they had state power, and they would wield it with great dominance. Those were dark visions that ended badly. So that's the post-liberal. Sorry, I'm going to move. I want to get to the AI stuff. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through this too. I did feel the obligation after having given you this kind of diagnosis, what's the prescription? If we're moving from this liberal world, which you could tell I kind of liked, right, to the post-liberal, which you could tell I kind of didn't like. So, where do we go? What does that mean? If we're in the post-liberal world, then what does that mean? Right? So, a couple of points I just want to, and you can read them on the slide, but I do think that we need to, the point I want to emphasize here is that we need to move forward, not backward. The one thing I hope you wouldn't take away from this lecture is that, oh, the liberal world was better, post-liberal world, not so much, so we need to go. No, we're not going back, we need to go forward. So we need a set of principles to do that. And so first principle is ethics is plural, not singular. Part of the problem with this strong do what they will, weak do what they must, this crude version of realism was this idea that whoever has power then calls the ethics. And no, we need to have a much more pluralistic view, one that also reaffirms checks and balances, acknowledges competing claims, and that understands ethics as a set of trade-offs, as a set of give and take, that it's about imperfections, it's about compromise. It's not about perfection and it's not about purity. I could say a lot more about that. I just want to put that point on the board. Ethics is plural, not singular. Second, ethics should be about managing differences. It's not about getting everybody to agree on some universal truth. And this is where I cite an article. You see I use the word mortar, not steel. A wonderful article by a scholar. It was published by Columbia University. Her name is Erica Harper, and she calls ethics, she wants to see it as the new mortar, not steel, to hold the structure together. Mortar being that material between the bricks, that distinctive substance that'll hold the bricks together. As that mortar as a method of reasoning that allows for critique without normative compliance. In other words, we can agree to disagree. Right? The ethics project doesn't fail when you get to disagreement. It actually should sort of start there. Okay. And we need to create a language, a vocabulary, a way to do that. In some ways, I'm going to go back to Carnegie. That's sort of what the court was supposed to be, like a way to do that. But we need to create new ways to do that so that we can have these principal disagreements. And she takes a little bit of a shot, a light one at the sort of human rights, international law world, because her point was that people are viewing that as steel. In other words, that it's just something that you can't deal with. It's yes or no. It's binary. You're either compliant or you're not. You either respect it or you don't. And I think she's looking for a little more room in that space. So anyway, there was something there that I thought was useful as we think about moving forward. Third, world order is always unfinished. I was sort of channeling, I guess, America 250, right? The American experiment, this idea that our political order is experimental, it changes, it evolves. If you're interested on the philosophical side, I was always taken with William James writes this beautiful essay, The Unfinished Universe, right? It's all about pragmatism and about how we move forward. But I think we need to think creatively about new arrangements, especially when we want to talk about issues like AI and other global scale issues like climate. Clearly, the current order that we have is not fit for purpose. The simple example: look at the permanent 5 members of the United Nations. Right, it's the world in 1945, right? And what about 1 billion people in India and whatever 300 million people in Nigeria, et cetera, right? I mean, it doesn't reflect the current world. So we need to evolve. Okay, let's go to AI. Yes, sorry, long wind up, but I hope it's useful for what I'm about to get into, because I think the values are important when we think about the norms and standards that we're going to use with AI. So you can recall the title of the talk is AI, Creature or Creator? And this framing is intentional, conjuring Frankenstein, right? It's a scientific project. AI is a scientific project of human creation. And the question is it taking on a life of its own? It's kind of a simple question. And also, I don't want to get down the Frankenstein route, but you should know that this is something, it's not completely new, right? And you can see this with any kind of scientific discovery of at that level. And I would even surmise you could talk about this with regard to DNA, right? The discovery of DNA, or the discovery of the atomic particles and so on, right? Really changing the way we understand the world. But the idea is, will this science take on a lot? It's human creation, but something's happening. Something really different is happening. And so I'm going to begin with a bunch of questions that come from this. And the first is deliberately provocative, although again, as I'm reading about stuff, people taking this pretty seriously, so why not? Does AI have a soul? What exactly is AI? If it's not human, is our goal then to make it human-centered? And if so, what does that mean? You're going to see a lot of stuff about human-centered AI. Okay, what does that mean? Okay, second, is this how the Enlightenment ends? Okay, that's a big question. In an AI world, what happens to reason as the ultimate authority? Will we give up on reason and turn to the algorithm? And then the buck stops where? This is the question of responsibility. So I'm realizing time's racing by, so we can go more back to some of these questions as we go. So does AI have a soul? Okay, so first of all, it's telling that anthropic, the name insinuates anthropomorphism, anthropic, and something's going on there, right? That is giving human characteristics to a non-human entity. So Claude is given a human name, and it's being trained to respond with human traits like empathy, kindness, respect. Anthropic published Claude's Constitution in January 2026, giving us a window into how the company is thinking about the nature of its product, it's a good thing to read. To me, it's an enlightening, if strange, document. It's written as a guide to Claude's development, almost as if Claude is a human. It's like a child. They're treating Claude like a child that needs to be raised and trained. Moral development. And it's interesting to look at who the authors are. It's a small group of people, but also Claude, by the way, is training itself. It's like asking the kid, what do you want for breakfast, right? The child training itself for its own moral. That's interesting. So it seems to me Claude is having a hand in writing his own constitution. So the question here is, what is Claude's moral status? Is something else happening here? Should we start to treat it like a child or like a human? But Anthropic also states, so in one level it has that in the Constitution, but it also states Claude's a different kind of entity which existing terms don't neatly apply. On balance, we should lean into Claude having an identity and help it to be positive and stable. They're molding the identity of its AI. So they're investing a lot into this, in its moral development, but there is an alternative point of view, and I just have one quote to give you the skeptical side. And I just pulled this out. Gideon Lewis Krauss spent 2 months in Anthropic's headquarters watching all this stuff happen. Here's a quote. A large language model, which is AI, is nothing more than a monumental pile of small numbers. It converts words into numbers, runs those numbers through a numerical pinball game, and turns the resulting numbers back into words. Similar piles are part of the furniture of everyday life. Meteorologists use them to predict the weather. Epidemiologists use them to predict paths of diseases. Among regular people, they do not usually inspire intense feelings. But when these AI systems begin to predict the path of a sentence, that is, to talk, the reaction was widespread delirium. End of quote. So which is it? Is Claude a new kind of entity capable of empathy and therefore deserving a moral status? Or is it nothing more than a monumental pile of numbers? Okay, so I'm just using Claude, but there are other AI systems that you can apply this thinking to. Okay, next point. Is this how the Enlightenment ends? I ripped off that title from an article written by, of all people, Henry Kissinger 8 years ago in 2018, and I was like, do I have to read this? I didn't want to read it. Because I just thought Henry Kissinger, he's like, almost 100, and he just wants to be cool and write about AI, and it's really, you should read it. It's really good. It was in the Atlantic magazine. I think it's publicly available. I'll try to summarize it really quickly. But the point of this is, I'm going to do the really quick version of this. So the point of it is, we move through 3 eras. And this also, I need to footnote the work of the historian Yuval Harari, who writes very, very well about this. We start with the age of the gods, with that authority comes from heaven. It comes from God, divine authority. It's revealed in some way. This is the basic of our moral understanding of our society, and you see it in the Judeo-Christian traditions, et cetera, et cetera. But there's this divine idea that goes into natural law and these kinds of things. And then that moves to, this is why the Enlightenment is so important, that we move from the heavens to the brain. That where does authority come from? Yeah, we still have all of the texts and we have our religious traditions, but it gets kind of translated into ethics in a way, and it goes into rationality. That the ultimate authority is reason, and it's human reason, and it's the ability of humans to reason. Right? But what Kissinger is saying, if we move to the algorithm, we're actually, and this is Harari, we're moving up to the clouds again. It's a different heaven. It's the cloud. It's like the AI cloud. But that's where authority, like you're going to ask you're going to ask Claude, like that's where that's going to be the authoritative place that we're actually giving up on reason, and we're going to trust the algorithm. And the algorithm is going to have ultimate authority. And so there are all kinds of questions that come to that. The main one I guess I want to emphasize here is the last point, which is the buck stops where. So if we're moving into a world like that, where is responsibility? How can you hold the AI accountable? And I think the impossible has happened because now I am actually interested in insurance. I never thought it'd be, like, I couldn't think of a more difficult or, wherever. But no, insurance is actually like really interesting now because it goes to liability, right? And I'm sure you can all think of your own. I have examples here, but you could probably all think of your own. If you're relying on an AI system and it fails, who's responsible? So you can think about this in relation to driverless cars. And all of these issues are going to be litigated soon. So there's one other really important dimension of this I want to raise, and then I'm going to stop because I want to make time for questions, which is I want to raise this issue of the power of the state and the power of the companies and kind of where that leaves us right now. The buck stops where, with AI, specifically with AI. So some of you may have read about the controversy between Anthropic and the Pentagon. It was huge news. And again, this was something that I was sort of trying not to pay attention to, but it came to me. And it was huge news it broke just before the war in Iran, the bombing. I think the news broke on Friday and the bombing started on Saturday. But it was this controversy, and I'll just read you a paragraph from the Wall Street Journal to summarize it. Anthropic has two concerns over two issues that it isn't willing to drop, according to a source familiar with the company's meeting with Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. AI-controlled weapons and mass domestic surveillance of American citizens. Those are the two issues. So Anthropic's point was they don't want Claude to be used by the government for mass surveillance or autonomous weapons, that those two areas should be off limits. And we don't want to sign a contract with you if you're going to use our stuff to do that. Anthropic believes AI is not reliable enough to operate weapons, and there are no laws or regulations yet that cover how AI could be used in mass surveillance, a source said. So that was the controversy. So here you have it, AI company Anthropic refusing to sign a government contract because the government refuses to abide by Anthropic's own code of ethics. In short, Anthropic believes its own products should not be used to automate weapons and should not be used in systems of mass surveillance. And we can surmise that part of the reason for Anthropic's reticence is its belief that its systems are just not ready to take on these tasks. But it also seems apparent in Claude's constitution that AI is intrinsically not meant for those jobs. Okay, I'm going fast over this, but something for you to think about. Intrinsically not. Intrinsically. So I don't know. I'm not sure what I think about that. But should we just say that, no, a machine should not be in charge of automated weapons that will take life, just as a matter of principle, or mass surveillance? These are open questions. This was AI. So anyways, you can all follow this in the news, but Pentagon feels strongly, no, we're in a race. We need to do this. You work for us. You're going to sign this. And if you don't sign this, by the way, this is important too. If you don't sign this, not only do you not get our business, but we're going to punish you. And they have ways to punish so that nobody else can do business with you either. No, we're going to shut you down. Right? So that's all happened and happening. The last one I want to raise, because this is too good not to mention, which is the other debate between Peter Thiel, who is one of the founders of Palantir, and the Holy Father, Pope Leo. So I know this sounds like a bad cartoon, but this is true. Short version is, again, look this up in the news. Peter Thiel has gone to Rome to give lectures on basically the evils of regulation, that the problem that we're facing right now is the state is so powerful, it's going to regulate AI, and that is a version of, in his words, the Antichrist. That this is the beginning of authoritarian, anti-Christian. It is the sort of incarnation of the Antichrist, the regulatory state that AI should be it should be unbounded, right? And Pope Leo, to his credit, he's been a little less hyperbolic, but he has been issuing statements, and there's a cardinal who's quite out front on this, and I'm sorry I don't remember his name, quite eloquent, who has been working with Pope Leo. And Leo, by the way, identified this as a key issue for his new pontificate, of the need for working with science, and not necessarily against it, but thinking about limits and about how science should be serving humanity. And the way it was put is, if you think that every possible solution and ultimately salvation, immortality, comes from technology, you have made technology your God, right? So you can see where the church would be against that. So let me just conclude then with, I think the challenge for us, I missed that, sorry. That was the quote I had. I'll leave it up there for you. So I think the challenge in conclusion is thinking about how AI is going to develop, what roles there should be for the state, what role there should be for the companies. One of my concerns is that the companies, and this is a difference between, let's say, Peter Thiel and Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie believed he had a responsibility to society. He believed he had a responsibility to the state. His philanthropy was directed toward those institutions. If you look at Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and others, they think that they exist above the state. Something else is happening. And this is definitely new. This is post-liberal. And I think it's a challenge for all of us to think new and creatively. And you can see here, this is my parting quote to you. How can we harness the power of AI for good and restrain it from bad, especially when there are forces looking to maximize their own narrow interests, and they are not necessarily looking out for you or for the common good? So with that, I'm going to stop. I spoke longer than I wanted to, but thank you for allowing me to share these thoughts with you, and I welcome your ideas and your feedback. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you again. I think we have time for just a few questions. Go ahead and please raise your hand. We're going to start right here for our first question. Please say your name and what you're studying if you're a student.
I'm Asher. I'm studying econ and poli-sci. So with the question, does AI have a soul? I think a big part of answering that question is understanding what a soul is. And just so I can understand where you're coming from, do you have any strong beliefs as to what that is and like what values you have upholding that belief, religious or philosophical, whatever you believe?
Wow, that's a great question I should have prepared for, right? Because it's such a profound. I think to the extent that I've thought about that, it goes to the question of moral status. In other words, is it a moral agent, and then with it, does it have the requirements of what a human being would have? And then, if you want to put it into a rights perspective, right? So does it have certain protections and entitlements and certain kind of then duties and obligations? Should we? I guess my question is, should we be putting it into that box, or, and in that sense, is it a creator? I guess my answer too would be, is it a creator? Does it have that status of a soul in that sense, or is it a creature, right? Or is it something that is of human design and should be serving human needs and aspirations? And so you can see that. I guess my point is there is a line of where what counts for being human, humanity, which in my view AI doesn't have, but I can see where the problems come.
All right, we're going to come here and then right up here after that.
Hey, I'm Skylar. I'm a political science and econ major. This is really relevant to what we're talking about just in like poli-sci right now. I'm more curious about this new emerging world order, because we mentioned that the current world order is ruptured and we have emerging powers that are coming on. So how do we reestablish ourselves as a legitimate order that abides by institutions and rules while still competing with emerging powers that have more momentum and are gaining momentum in this system?
Yeah, I wish I had the the answer. I guess I would just go back to basics to say the first thing to do is to identify the commonality. That going back to what is the universal moral sense, but also universal interest. So I always think in terms of values and interests, right? So and there's this sort of at some point, by virtue of being human, there's something that we all share. And I think that it needs to start with that, and then you need to build the different kinds of arrangements, kind of like Carnegie did, but in ways that will recognize the competing interests and give them room to maneuver, but come to some, I use that term, modus vivendi, right? A way of living together or managing differences. So clearly, whatever we've had that have gotten us to this point has sort of exhausted itself. So there needs to be a kind of a refounding in that way. And my sense is, though, that it's not going to happen in a kind of a grand way or somebody thinking it up or presenting it like this, that it's actually going to be more of a ground up thing. Like they're just like stuff that needs to happen. Like even if you just look at, for example, now, foreign aid, human development, right? Okay, if the system is fractured and then broken, like the need still exists, so it's going to have to get like rebuilt because it's there. I feel the same on all these other global scale issues, even climate. It's likely to be, like almost like a ground up, technology by technology, step by step, piece by piece, and then eventually you come to some, like the word is convention, some kind of rules or norms for how to handle this issue. If you look at the history of the internet, actually, is an interesting example. Here you got this new technology, and like, okay, how are we going to use it? Well, it kind of came from the ground up. So, it was kind of built. Okay, we're gonna. These are the codes you need to use to log on and all this kind of stuff. So it's very instrumental, very functional. So that's kind of where my thoughts are now, because I just feel like it's the only way to do it. Instrumental, functional, almost engineering, and build it up from there.
Going to come here. Raise your hand if you have a question so we know. I'm going to come up to the front next. Start here.
My name is Abby, and I'm studying International Studies and Geography. And I had a question. So in early February, the safety lead at Anthropic resigned. And if I could, I'd like to share just a quote from his letter for a question. So he says, "We appear to be approaching a threshold where our wisdom must grow in equal measure to our capacity to affect the world, lest we face the consequences." And my question is, do you think that we are at that threshold? And if we are, or when we approach it, do you think that our wisdom will measure up to our capacity to affect the world?
So that's a great question. Thank you for flagging this theme. I think it's really important. I will refer you to an article on the Carnegie Council website that was written by a friend of mine a few years ago. The title of it is "Why Democracy versus Autocracy Misses the Point." And I'll confess to you, as I confessed to him, at first I was like, what? Like and I kept reading it, thinking, and I think it took me a while to get to it. And I think the point he was making was similar to the one I think you're raising, which is, and it's part of what Kissinger was worried about, where, if we're in an AI world and we're in this world of information that's filtered in this way, and that so much of our thinking is exported, and being done in this way, where is our agency and where is our capacity, not only for thinking but for acting? So I think that just having, and then also, by the way, on top of that, you have deliberate misinformation, and then you have the speeding up nature of AI and all the other stuff. So it's very worrying. So I think step one is recognizing it and having some level of self-awareness. But I think it's also why I ended where I ended. I do think that we're going to need new approaches from both the state and the market and the companies. I think that it's just they're both doing what they do, but I think the answer needs to come from those institutions. But then there's also this other, like, where's the power of the people and all this? Like, it's sort of unclear to me. Most of the early predictions about the internet was that it was going to be empowering people, and it's turned out to be the opposite, but maybe that'll flip. I don't know. So that's a long ramble to your really good question.
Hi, my name is Dominique.
Oh, you're here.
I'm majoring in political science with
Yeah.
an emphasis on international studies and a minor in economics. And my question goes back to who bears the responsibility, and especially with court cases like Meta have gone through and that they've been found guilty, or that the civil liability that they have to pay. Can you speak on, do you think these companies bear a great responsibility of what their technology and how they, influence?
So I have a very old school answer to that, which goes back to just basic theory about business ethics, if you will. The whole idea of a corporation is that it gets its license from in the old days it was from the king, from the sovereign, from the political entity. It gets licensed to operate. And with it, it gets protection of law and protection of the state. But as a consequence, it has responsibilities to the society and to the common good. And the whole idea of a corporate structure is accountability, that there's a return address in a specific place. And that's why it has a board of directors and a CEO. So I am very old school about that. There was a phrase back in the early business ethics days, the problem with corporations, whatever, it has no soul to damn and no pants to kick, right? But the idea being it's just like the big thing, but I think we need to kind of think about that. No, a corporation, I don't want to say it has a soul, you pushed me. But it has obligations, and it should be held accountable. And so I hope that we move more in that direction. I think the challenge is going to be in the detail, like, okay, what does that mean, and how do you have some kind of meaningful response to the principle? Yeah.
All right, I think we're coming right here for our
Yeah.
last question
Okay.
of the day.
Sorry to take the last question. My name is Olivia. I'm studying health, society, and policy. And I just, with the introduction of various AI models, and kind of as the Pentagon is partnering with using artificial intelligence for international security, and other companies start to use it for personal, individualized security purposes, do you think that there would be the possibility to introduce something like a universal ethical standard when it comes to international intelligence? Or is that just something that's too obscure?
That's a really good question. My gut response is maybe to try to, I don't think we're ever going to be able to figure out what's actually good, but we may be able to figure out what's bad. In other words, some kind of minimums. It would be more of these are the things you can't do. I think that's where I would start, and you'd have more of a chance of maybe getting agreement on that. But once you get into the more prescriptive, general uses, is really hard. So I'd kind of think about it. I hadn't really thought about it before you asked the question, but yeah, again, these are prohibited, and start there and see if you could get agreement on that. It's probably worth doing. Yeah.
All right, unfortunately, that does wrap up our time, but please join me in thanking Mr. Rosenthal for joining us today. I'd like to point out there's some literature about the Carnegie Council left on this small table on your way out. I invite you to check it out, grab some things, stay involved, stay connected, and thank you for being here.
Nick.
Thank you.
That's perfect.
Okay. You are.